All right, welcome everybody to our this month's presentation. Today we're welcoming Brian Kwong from Better Partners. He will be giving us a great presentation today, going over all of the fun we're getting ready to look forward to with converting from workflow and process builder over to flow. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Brian, and let you run with it.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah.
So my name is Brian Kwong. I've been a Salesforce MVP forever. I actually co-lead the Madison, Wisconsin group up here, and somewhat help out with Milwaukee. We used to cover the entire state, and then we had to split into specific municipalities. I've been with Better Partners now for 6 years. We're what I like to call boutique consultant shop. We're not huge. We specifically work with the SMBs and nonprofits, typically helping already existing customers of Salesforce make sure that their platform continues to serve their organization as they change. The reason you're here, other than the fact it's great just to see people, is the fact that Salesforce made the announcement at Trailhead DX not too long ago that workflow rules and process builder are going to go away and flow is the future. So we're going to talk about that. The first thing I will have to say about it is don't panic. Just because something's going away doesn't mean it will magically stop working for you. As a matter of fact, some folks who may have been doing Salesforce as long as I have may recall something called an S control. It was basically a fancy JavaScript way to control things back in Classic like 10 years ago. I still find orgs with working S controls even then, even they haven't existed for 8 years. So don't panic. But it is something we want to plan for. Salesforce will probably start by saying, hey, you don't get to build any more workflow rules or building more process builders, and then new customers won't be able to do them at all. But they're not going to just suddenly stop working on you. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with workflow rules because, to be quite honest, they're the simplest things that you could potentially migrate. So simple that there's currently a migration tool available, but there are some catches with that, and we'll talk about that. Once we'll do that and we'll start a migration of a workflow rule to give you an idea of what it will look like, we will also take a look at process builder and talk about why it's different and some considerations and just best practices you should keep in mind when you're doing a migration. This is a slide-free presentation. This is all demo of me just yapping at you. And what I would ask is if you have a question, I would rather you come off mute or put it in the chat and ask it right then and there than waiting to the end. And the reason for that is when we're dealing with automation stuff like this, it can be very complicated. And what I don't want to do is have you lose the context to your question and then having to backtrack and try to find it. So just go ahead and ask the question. The other thing I will ask is sometimes I get really excited about flow stuff and I tend to talk a little fast. So if I start talking too fast or I need to repeat something, don't hesitate to say, hey, Brian, can you slow down? Can you repeat what you just said or whatever the case may be? This is, an informal friends among friends presentation and how we can improve our Salesforce world. All right. That said, I have to do the obligatory put on the wizard hat thing because I am known as the Salesforce wizard.
Yes.
And since I don't go to in-person events thanks to a pandemic and a compromised immune system, this is the closest I get. It's not going to stay on for the entire thing because, headphones don't fit really well over this, and it gets hot. So we are looking at Salesforce. Everyone should be looking at this. Is this readable to everyone? Or should I blow it up?
Looks good to me.
Jason?
Looks good to me. Everybody else good with it?
As anything, sharing everything with the video can look a little funky. So if people are having difficulty reading something, let me know. But this is my glorification workflow rules. We have only 3 rules in here. They're all on opportunities. We have a closed one rule that is going through and sending an email and then doing a field update on the account. We have another one that's firing off of negotiation, that's creating a task and then updating the field on the opportunity. And then our last rule is a time-based one, that's firing when things are closed. And so we're sending reminder dates 10 days and 30 days after something is closed. So let's migrate this. Let's start by hitting our migration tool. We'll go ahead and do our search in the quick find, which is probably the best thing to show up in Salesforce setup in years. We'll click migrate. You can see we have a list of our workflow rules here, and we can only select one at a time. So let's start from top, work our way down. So we hit our very first one, we'll hit migrate to flow, and we get an error. And this is because we're doing a cross object field update. So we're triggering on the opportunity, but we're trying to update the account. And right now, in the current version of this migration tool, that is not something that it can handle. All right, no worries. Let's do the next one. And we'll hit migrate, and we get stopped here too, because we are trying to create a task. And for some reason, that is currently not available. So there's a bunch of things that are supported in here. So I'm going to paste this little help link into the chat so people will have it. But it does not do cross object field updates. It does not do task workflow actions. So any workflow rules that are using those things, you cannot currently use the migration tool to migrate them. However, it does support a lot of things here. So one of the things I would suggest is, we're coming up in a new release. I think it's supposed to be mid-September. And if there's one thing that you should definitely make sure that you look for in the release notes, is updates to this tool, because Salesforce is going to continue to update this and try to make it as simple as possible. And for all I know, this presentation is going to completely change in about 6 weeks, because it will just migrate everything. But for now, this is something you have to take in mind. We'll move that off to the side. So that leaves our time-based one, and we'll click the migrate. No error. That's always a good news. And we have a couple of buttons here. One of them is in step 2 that says switch activations. This will deactivate your workflow rule and activate your flow. Yes, you could do this. No, I don't think you should. And the reason for that is I think you should take a look at the flow that was built by the migration and make sure that there's nothing that you want to have changed first. The other thing I would say is the only time I would see wanting to activate this right away is if and deactivate your workflow rule is if you're migrating in production. And none of us are going to be doing any of this in production, right? No, none of us. Oh, this is all stuff that we should do in a sandbox, and only a sandbox, and then deploy the flows after we migrate them, because this is automation. This is all stuff that hopefully has been well vetted, well documented, and you don't want to end up making a mistake and then ruining things and maybe not finding out that you have automations that are firing and making errors in your system for weeks potentially before you catch them. So I wouldn't recommend doing it in production, and I wouldn't recommend you activate them right away. I would suggest you click this test in flow builder, because it's going to open up a tab and it will take us to the flow that was built. And so we can see here, we have a very simple flow. We have 3 paths. That's what these little lines are coming from this start button. And we have 2 elements, or in this case, they're actions, one for the email templates for each path. So a very, very simple flow. But I would not activate this right away. And one of the reasons for that is because of the way that this migration tool is currently labeling things. So you can see we have schedule 1 path or schedule path 2. And sure, that's accurate. We have 2 paths, but why would I not want to do that? So what happens when you don't switch now and you have both flow and workflow active? That's a great question. What happens is you have the workflow rule and the flow going at the same time, but only if they're both active. And so when you're ready to say, this is the flow that I'm wanting to have active, you're going to manually hit the deactivate button on your workflow rule and click the activate button on your flow. If you're doing this in the sandbox, like I'm recommending, you'll do all your flow work in your sandbox, and then you can use a chain set or a deployment tool to move the flow into your production environment, and it will move inactive unless you do a bunch of other stuff that likely you're not going to do to make it active. It will be inactive, so it will be there until you're ready to go in production and say, okay, deactivate the rule, click to activate on the flow. And the timing is such as very minimal.
Quick question.
Yes, Barbara.
When you click the switch thing, is it just merely deactivating the workflow and activating the flow, or
Yes.
does it actually delete the workflow?
It does not delete anything.
Okay. Okay. So because when you're testing, you have to deactivate one and activate the other to make sure that it's working without both of them being active, right? Because that would be weird to have for both of those things to
Yes.
fire off.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, when you're in the sandbox and you're doing your actual testing, you will want to deactivate it, but I wouldn't switch it, mainly because I think you should take a look at it first.
Right,
Because,
right.
like, in this example, I wouldn't want to activate this because I think schedule path 1 and schedule path 2 is stupid naming. It doesn't tell you anything, right? So we have 30-day and 10-day. So schedule path 1, we're going to make 30 days after close. And I'm going to delete the API name, go back to the path, and just do that because it is simpler. And this is 10 days after close. And that makes it just more readable and more understandable what the heck is going on with this flow. And we'll just hit save. All right. So at this point, what we could do is we could go ahead and hit the activate button and then go and do our normal testing after we deactivate our workflow rule. Or you could use the debug button. I'm not going to do either of those things at this point because debugging and testing email alerts in a dev org like this is kind of lame. Plus my inbox is really messy, so no one wants to see that. But that leaves us with these workflow rules that we couldn't migrate. But here's the good news. Migrating workflow rules are not going to be difficult. They're going to be overwhelmingly very, very simple flows because with workflow rules, there's not a whole lot that we can do to them. So if we look at this, we start with the negotiation review one here. If I'm recreating this exactly to work exactly the same way with workflow rules, we would end up with one flow that creates the task and do the field update. But here's where flows are different. With workflow rules, everything happens in an after context, meaning it goes through the entire process of reviewing and evaluating, should this something be saved? Like it goes through validation rules and all the triggers and all that other stuff. Then it passes off to the server as like a temporary place. Then it does the workflow rules. And then it saves it finally to the server. With Flow, we could do something that we can also do with Apex, where we get in between and say, before you go to the server, I want to make a change. And that tends to be not only faster, but is more optimized than updating the record twice. Because if you think about it, if we're updating the opportunity that this is triggering, what you're really doing is saying, hey, Salesforce, I want you to do this save, do all these actions, save it to the server. Now I'm going to update the record that you just evaluated and have you redo all the actions and save it to the server. It does it twice. And if we can interject ourselves and just do it once, it's going to be faster, both for the end user and just for the platform in general. Realistically speaking, is anyone going to notice if we migrated this into a single flow, all fire and after? No, it won't. No one's going to notice. If you have a lot of automation, is it noticeable? Yeah, it is definitely noticeable. I've counted up to 5 to 7 seconds for a customer that has a whole bunch of after flows in the system where the person hits save and they literally wait for 7 seconds for that little thing to finish before their record is actually saved. We took a look at what they did and we moved it to a whole bunch of it to before, and it cut it down to 2 seconds, right? And that doesn't sound like a lot, but you can imagine as an end user, it feels like a lot. So when I see something like this, I would actually say this is something that I will split into two different workflow or two different flows. One that will handle the task being created in an after context, and one that will handle the field update in a before. And we're going to create both because it sounds like a lot. It really, really isn't. So we'll go to flow and we'll open this in a new tab. And let's start with the after one, creating that task, because this is probably going to be a very simple thing to do. So on our flow, we're going to click new flow, and we're going to be presented with a bunch of options. When we're dealing with workflow rules and process builder migration, everything you're going to do is record triggered flow. All these others are really cool, really great. If you're not familiar with them, I would encourage you to learn about them. But for today, we're just going to focus on record trigger flow. So when we first start, we have to kind of define the details of this workflow rule. So we know this is going to be fired on the opportunity. Well, we know this is going to be something that can happen when it's created or updated. And we know there's conditions. And if we look back at our workflow rule, our conditions is simply that the stage is a negotiation review, and we only want to have these fire up when they move to negotiation review. So if someone just hits edit and save, and it's already in that stage, we're not firing the actions. They have to actually have changed the stage to negotiation and review. So we'll select our criteria. Stage equals, I'm blind. There it is, negotiation review. Right. So very similar to how workflow rules set up. Then we have, when is the flow going to update these records? This is the exact same bit that we get in workflow rules where it's talking about using the subsequently. And that's this radio button. This is the one that you're probably going to be using most often. Essentially, it means that if the record is edited and already meets the conditions that we specified here, it's not going to fire their actions. It will only do that if the record didn't meet the criteria and then moved to meet the criteria. This optimized flow, this is where we get to say before and after. And anytime that you're doing anything that is not modifying the record itself that's triggering the automation, that's going to be after. So creating tasks, doing cross-object formulas, sending emails, all that should always happen in the after context. So this is the one we're going to start with. Click done. Here's our wonderful little flow trigger. And for people who are not completely familiar with flow, I'll do the really quick high-level overview. On the left-hand side, we have the manager. This is going to list out things as we build them. Resources are everything that we could use regarding how we store data. So like a record, or maybe it's just a number or text. And then in the center here, this is our canvas. This is where we're going to do our painting, essentially. And we get there by hitting the little plus sign, which typically isn't covered up, but I'm so zoomed in here, it covers up here a little bit. But if we hit the plus sign, you can see it gives us our options for elements. Elements are basically all the little boxes that we get to have on our canvas. And we're going to be doing creating a task. And there's two ways to create records. One of them is we can create a resource that represents the task, then we can set the values for that task, and then we can create it. Most of the time, that's the option I like to use because I'm old, and that's how I got used to doing it. To be quite honest, when I'm trying to break myself up, that is that habit, because you really only need to do that if you're dealing with multiple records now. For what we're doing, we're going to actually scroll all the way down to the pink section, the data, and we're going to select create records. And this is where we're going to define our tasks that we're going to be creating. So this is create task, creates the task for negotiation review. There we go. We're only doing one. If we select this one, it's assuming we're using the method I was just talking about, where we create a resource that represents the record. We're not doing that. We're going to do everything in this one element. So we need to say, well, this is the object that we're doing, and here are the fields. And now I don't remember what tasks I'm going to create. So I'm going to go back here and let's look at the task that we have. So this task is, the subject is called a follow up with contact. We want the due date to be 10 days from the close date. And it's assigned to the opportunity owner. Okay, we can do that. So let's start with the assigned. So we type our assigned to ID, we select that. And then to get to the owner of the opportunity, we could either scroll through this list here, or you could type record or opportunity. Anything, any record trigger flow that you have, the triggering record is going to be listed as this $sign record. So by clicking on here, I'm now looking at all my opportunity fields, and we'll just select owner ID. Right, so task owner IDs to the opportunity ID. Then we have the subject of our task, and this I literally just copied and pasted from our workflow rule. Now we have the we need to associate this with the opportunity, so we're going to do what ID, which is the basically the what is this associated to, not the who it is associated to. And this is just plain old ID. And then the last thing is the due date. So here's the activity due date. And it's expecting an actual date field. And that's not something we have, right? We don't have a date that magically represents 10 days before the close date. We need to create one. And we're going to do that by creating a resource. So we'll click new resource. And we have a whole bunch of different stuff here. Most of the resources that you're going to create are either going to be variables or formulas. There are places for text templates. I can honestly say I think I've used constant once in my life, and I've never used stage thus far. So you don't need to get too hung up with the values. In our case, we're going to do a formula. And this is going to be basically the due date. Activity 10 days before close date. Okay. Data type is the date. And now here's what's interesting. This formula builder has almost all the functions and features as the field formula builder. It just doesn't look like it does. So you can't, you have all the functions available here that you may want to use. And our circumstance, it's going to be really, really simple because we're just taking a date and subtracting 10 days. But if you ever run into and say, hey, I need a formula, maybe it does the uppercase, or you're doing a case formula, or I'm trying to think of other functions that you have in the formula builder. A cheat that I would use is I will actually build a fake formula field to get access to the advanced formula builder that has all the functions listed for you. And they use it, copy it, and paste it in here, and then replace all the references to be flow references, because the function names are the same. But in this case, I need to start with the close date. So we've got the close date from our record. And then we'll just do minus 10. There we go. So now we have our owner set, our subject set, it's associated to the opportunity, and we have our due date. Done. Okay, that's it. That's all we need to do for this particular flow beyond saving it. The one thing I will tell you from here is pick a naming convention. I don't care what it is, just be consistent. So when you look at it, you know what it is, what it's doing. I usually try to keep these as narrow as possible. So after negotiation review. That's not how you spell negotiation. Thank you, Otacar. Okay, hit save. And at this point, we could debug it, or we could activate it and then do regular testing to it. But we're going to leave this and go back to our workflow and take a look at our other item, and this is a field update to the opportunity that's triggering it. And this is literally just putting the next step field to say call prospect to negotiate contract. So let's create our other flow for this. So record trigger flow. This is going to be almost identical to the way that we did it. So we're doing it on the opportunity, we're doing it on record to create. We're having our stage be set to negotiation and review. We only want to do this when it meets the criteria. And the only change that we make here is we are going to select fast field updates because we're updating the opportunity that's triggered the particular automation. Okay. We can actually use the shortcut here to say, hey, we're going to update the opportunity, the triggering record. Okay, so we could do this. It works exactly the same as if it works exactly the same as if we were doing an update of any other record. I don't typically do this when I'm setting things, and I can't really tell you why, but I'll show you what I usually do, and that is I do what's called an assignment. An assignment is just something that lets you set values. It assigns values. And I do this because this is how a lot of the things that when you are creating records, especially in bulk, this is kind of the frame that you're working with. We don't actually need to do an update because what you're doing is injecting yourself between the user clicking the save button and the save actually occurring in the server. So all we're actually doing is changing something. We're assigning a value in between those two steps. So at this point, all we need to do is set the value. So we don't actually have to do an update. By simply doing that assignment like that, we're done. That's all there is. We've successfully migrated this. We can save our flow here. And this is before negotiation. Minus the fact that I cannot spell. Okay, there's our wonderful items. So that leaves our closed one here. And if I look at this, we're doing an update to an account, so that's an after. We're doing an email, so that's an after. So all the action in here are all happening an after. However, we're not going to create a new flow for this. Anyone know why? It's because we already have a flow that is firing on the stage closed one. So the one that we migrated with that had time-based actions on it is also firing on closed one. So there's no reason to create a new flow. We're simply going to take the one that we already migrated with the time-based and we're going to add to it. And the reason why I like to use this, even though it's 3 workflow rules, Brian, how could you possibly have screwed that up to begin with? You wouldn't believe the number of orgs I've walked into where the criteria between rules overlaps so often that it really doesn't make sense to migrate them as separate individual items. You should really take this opportunity to clean up your automation so it's as optimal as possible. And this is one of the ways. And we're going to go from having 2 workflow rules to 1 flow in this circumstance. So let's open up our flow that I had previously created called migrated opportunity time-based. And we have our 30 days after close or 10 days after close. And what we're doing is we're hitting the run immediate items. So if we look at this, let's do the email alert first. We have this email alert called opportunity closed one. And the first thing that people have a tendency to do when they're getting into flow is they go, oh, we're doing an email. So I'm going to go action and I'm sending an email. So I'm going to use the send email action. And that's not wrong. However, it's not what I would recommend. And I don't recommend this for a couple reasons. Number one, you're migrating a workflow rule. You already have what goes into the body of the email, who's getting that email. You have that all defined already as an email alert. The second reason I don't like using send email without good calls and flows is the fact that if anything changes, you have to modify the automation directly. So if someone says, hey, Brian, I want you to change the net subject, or I need to swap Jason with Barbara as a recipient, you have to come into the automation and change it. And I hate having to change automation when I don't have to change automation. Because anytime you take an opportunity to change automation, you run the risk of making an error. So we're not going to just send an email. We are going to select action. And if we look at our name of our alert here, it's called opportunity closed one notification. So if we search for it, here's our opportunity closed one notification email alert. We can select that. And all we have to specify is the record that we're using the email alert on. So, which is just the ID or a triggering record. So workflow rules are going away. The things that are used by workflow rules, like email alerts, are not going away right now. So we can get away with using these, and we might as well, because we might as well make our life easier on this. Because, hey, if someone goes through and say, hey, I need to change who's getting it, great, modify the email alert. Don't have to touch the flow. Need to change what is in the body of the email or subject, great, modify the email template. Don't have to modify the flow. Perfect stuff. All right, so we hit done. That's our first action. We basically just moved it from one to the other. The next, we're doing the field update to the contact, or excuse me, the account, where we're setting the type to be customer direct. In most cases of flow, you need to have the record that you're updating in your flow as a reference someplace. In our particular circumstance, we know what the account is because it's related to our opportunity. So we don't need to try to say, hey, we need to go get this account and then we can make changes to it. We're going to just go and say, hey, we're going to update an account. We'll tell you what the account is based off of this bit of information then updated. So if we go down to our pink area and we select update records, okay, we can say, well, we're not modifying the opportunity. We're not using a resource. That's what this option is. We're going to basically tell you what the object is and then which object. And the easiest way for us to do this is simply saying, well, the account ID is the same as our opportunity account ID. That's all we need to do to say, what account are we updating? And then we simply pick the field that we're changing and we pick our value, customer direct. Done. So there we go. We've migrated all three workflow rules. All we need to do is save, but this is no longer just time-based. So these are all after closed one actions. So we relabel it so it makes more sense. There we go. We're effectively done. All we have to do is test. And there's two ways of testing workflow rules. You can activate this. You can go to an opportunity. You can test, play it as a user. And I would recommend that you actually do that. It's a good practice to do it at least a little bit. But we can also use the debugger. And I'm going to not focus on the debugger, but I do want to show it to you because it's a great tool to use with these record trigger flows. And if we click debug, okay, the first thing is we can only test one path at a time. We can test our run immediately at 30 days or 10 days. We'll do the run immediately because testing email alerts are boring. You can skip the requirements, which basically means you can use a record in your test here that is not closed one or is already closed one. It just ignores the criteria that we define in our startup element. We're not going to do that. We could run this as a different user. This is definitely something I recommend that you do. You do have to turn this on. It's under the process automation settings. It's just a little checkbox to check. And if we select this, it will let us pick a different user to run this as. I mainly suggest that you do this after you've done your own testing as an admin, simply because of the fact that I cannot tell you the number of times that I've seen flows fail because they were perfectly for an admin. And then you go, oh yeah, Jason doesn't have access to that particular field in his FLS, so of course the flow won't work. Okay. Then we're going to say, well, let's pretend is the flow be created, as in the record is being created or it's updated. We're doing update. And then we can pick our opportunity. I just happen to have this Tampa, Florida community group opportunity here. So we'll pick that. It gives us basically a preview of our opportunity. And we can say that, hey, our stage is prospecting. Well, you know what? We're going to pretend that we're changing this to closed one. So I change the stage. I'll click run. And we can see the path that is taken in yellow. We can see went all the way from the start to our end. So that means that we were successful, or at least it got to the end without throwing an error. It hit the email alert, hit the update account. On the right-hand side are the debug status. This is where all the heavy information is. So I can see, hey, this is the user that started it. This is the record that was used. This is when it was started, what the conditions were. If, email alert, there's like nothing in an email alert. That's why they're boring to test for demo presentations. And then we can look at the update. We can see, okay, here's the account. There's the account that we changed. This is the value that was changed to, and we can see what the results were. And then we can see that change was rolled back. So if we went into our to that record in our developer box here, we would see that it was not marked as closed one. That change got closed or rolled back. This information, the debug, is almost the exact same thing you would get in an email if you got an error, which is why I like to point it out, because it is so useful in trying to figure out where did things go wrong. All right, so we got 20 minutes left before we for us to hit any questions and before we talk process builder. Before we go to process builder, does anyone have something they would like to ask now?
I had a quick one. So the debug, is it actually committing and then rolling back, or is it just pretending to commit?
It's actually committing and rolling back.
Okay, so if you have something if you have other things that are triggering off of that, it could, in theory, kick those off.
Yes.
Oh.
It treats it as an actual update.
Okay.
As the debug tool used to never roll back. It's relatively new to Flow.
Yeah.
Right. So I got to take this off. It's getting too hot. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was wondering how it did that. If it was
and
running
not all things get rolled back. That's the other thing to be aware of, right? Because obviously, like an email alert will go out because you can't roll back an email alert. It's only DML that can get rolled back.
Yeah.
DML, basically anything being updated, created, or technically deleted, but it's really updated, created. All right. Anything else? We have workflow rules from a managed package. Do we need to migrate them to Flow? Although that's on the managed package person. The only time you would need to do that is if you took one of their workflow rules and you cloned it to make your own changes to it. Then that you would have to migrate. But it, like Nonprofit Success Pack has a whole bunch of their own workflow rules. That's on them to take care of unless you cloned them. All right. So let's leave the world of workflow rules and talk about process builder. So I have a process here. You can see we have a bunch of nodes, some firing on stages, some that's not firing in stages. And before we start migrating, let's talk about how we should migrate processes. The knee-jerk reaction most people have is, well, this is process. Behind the scenes, it's created a flow. So therefore, we should just be able to use one flow for the whole process. And while the answer to that is absolutely positively yes, you can, it's also no, you shouldn't. And the reason for that is because when Process Builder was built, even though it was built on top of the flow engine, it does things and organizes things in flow differently than how we would do it with Record Trigger, because Record Trigger flows didn't exist when Process Builder was designed. And as a person who's been able to kind of accidentally find the flows that get created by Process Builder and looking at, I can tell you from a maintenance standpoint, you don't want to be managing one of those flows. It is a nest egg in there. In reality, the right way to try to do this is take a look at the process and look at what's being done. Record trigger flows are definitely different than all the other automation tools we have in our declarative toolbox. If you have a flow that runs only when the stage is qualification and only when the stages needs analysis, and someone goes through and makes updates on opportunity record to be closed won, you won't see the two flows even in the debug log. They won't get evaluated. Salesforce is using that start element criteria to really determine, do I even need to run this flow or not? And it is actually in our favor to not run flows when we don't need the flows to run. If we try to rebuild this and flow as one big flow, we need to fire it at any circumstance where the stage could be in any of these things. And in fact, because we have this one little diamond here that is discount applied, we could apply a discount at any point in any stage, right? So if we were going to do this in flow, we would have to have the flow run every single time and then have all these pathways to say, is it this stage? Is it this stage? Or maybe was the discount applied? It becomes horrendously more complicated. The better way to do it is to take each one of these criteria nodes and look at them as individual sets of things to migrate. The one thing I would say is I'm cheating a little bit for demonstration purposes because I only have one process. Like there are orgs out there that you could have tens or more process builders even on one object, regardless of the fact that Salesforce only wanted you to have one. And it is going to be a bear to migrate that without some planning ahead of time. The recommendation I would say is if you don't have your automation documented now, this is a great time to document your automation. And I don't care how you do it. I've done this in spreadsheets. I've used Elements Cloud. Quite honestly, my favorite was a bunch of multicolor Post-it notes and a whiteboard where I used that to basically represent all my automation and what actions were happening. So I can go, okay, these two color Post-it notes represent this process and workflow rule that really should be combined into one flow. I'm a very tactile person. I like that. It doesn't matter as long as you do it. And one of the benefits of doing that is the fact that you don't have to do this migration all at once. You can take a look at your documentation and what's happening in your org, and you can say, this is the high priority stuff. It's critical that this stuff works. So let's migrate that first. Or you can go through and say, we're going to only do a certain amount of these a day because technically speaking, this is all tech debt. Your end users don't care if it's process or if it's flow that's firing. Chances are your managers don't care either, as long as things work, right? They just want things to work. So use the time to document it and then go through and put a plan in place. So like if I had a whole bunch of processes, maybe I wasn't going to be able to migrate this whole process at once. I would go through and say, okay, let's take a look and determine how I would move this to flow. And then maybe I'll go through and say, look, I already have a flow that's doing closed won, right? So let's migrate the actions for this into our closed won flows. And then I will delete this node from the process builder and create a new process version and keep the rest of this process until I'm ready to migrate the rest of it. Okay. So those are all considerations. So if we were going to go through this like that, I can see I have 4 diamonds. It looks like they're all firing in stages, qualification, needs analysis. We already saw closed won. Then we have this discount applied. So I will go, okay, I potentially could have 4 different flows here, right? Because I want to keep the criteria as narrow as possible to really optimize how our flow is being run. But then if I look at the actions, I can see, well, it needs analysis. I'm doing a chatter post and I'm updating a field on the opportunity. This one line makes sense to split into 2. One that does the chatter post and one that's updating the opportunity, just like we did with that one workflow rule where we were updating the opportunities next step in addition to what was it, sending an email or whatever it was. I just did it. I already forgot.
Yeah, it was setting the next step and then
yeah,
sending out an email or something.
it was email. Okay.
Yep.
So just like that example, this would be one where, hey, we should split it into 2. Okay. For our discount, this is an email alert, so that's definitely a separate flow. And for a closed one, well, let's see, we know with the actions, hey, this is setting the customer to direct. I had a workflow route that did the exact same thing. I don't need to migrate this action because we already did it. All this time I've had a process and a workflow rule firing at the same time. Well, was unfortunate. And then I have this other action that's firing 60 days after close date where I'm creating an opportunity. So this would just be, add this one action to our existing flow. So we got a couple things that we can do. We're going to do this one first, and then I'll let the group decide which of the other nodes they would like us to migrate, because I want to be cognizant of our time. But if we look through here, we have 2 things. One, we have a scheduled path that we need to create 60 days after close date. And then we have the action to create the opportunity for renewal. So first thing, we're going to click edit flow to get out of our debug. We need to create our path. So we're going to click in our start element, go down to schedule paths, and we'll just hit the little plus sign next to schedule paths. And this is what 60 days after close date. When the based on the close date, offset is 60 days after. Perfect. So we get our whole new path showing up right here. And now we just need to create our opportunity. So we'll hit the plus sign. Go down to our pink stuff. We're only going to create one, so we can just use create records. Oh my gosh, I cannot type. We're going to do 1. We're using our separate values here. We're doing an opportunity. Great. Now we just need to go back and review what are we setting this as. So close date is today, the date that the opportunity is being created. The stage is prospecting, and the name is just renewal opportunity. So let's name. And let's see, close date. We could create a formula like we did with the other for the activity date to say, hey, this is today. We don't actually have to do that. If you're using the current date, that is actually something that's already available to us as under this $sign flow. Since this is going to run 60 days from the close date, the current date is actually 60 days from the close date. It's when it's actually creating this opportunity, so we can get away with current date. We don't need a formula that does close date plus 60 or anything like that. And then what was our last stage for prospecting? So let's set our stage value. And now that I'm looking at it, I realize there's a problem with my process builder. I don't set the account anywhere here. I've been sitting this and creating renewal opportunities all this time floating in La La Land. Well, that's not good. So let's fix that. It'll be the same account as our originating opportunity. There we go. We've hit save and or save as if this was already activated, create a new version, and we've effectively migrated that portion of our process builder. All right. Questions on this or any votes on what they would like to have me migrate that's left in this process? Jason, it sounds like you get the pick.
Okay.
What would you like to migrate?
I mean, let's do the needs analysis one because it's got a chatter post and an update next step.
Yeah.
And
All right.
and I want to see how they evaluate the next criteria comes into play, if at all.
Oh, sure. All right. So this is what we're gonna do. We could do back to our flow, click the new flow button, just like we have been. But we don't have to. We can use the fancy flow trigger explorer. And what I like about this is it shows us everything that's happening on it. So we can pick our object. We can say, hey, is it created, updated, deleted? And we can see what things happen. We can also change the order. So Jason, to your example of being able to say evaluate next criteria, you only build this in flow is if the next diamond that you have in the list is also going to be in the same flow. In our circumstance, because we're building this as a separate flow, you don't need to evaluate the next criteria because it's in a different flow. But you may have a circumstance where you want to have certain things happen before others, like an order of operations. And this is where you can use your trigger explorer here to go through and say, well, look, I really want this to happen before this. So you can edit the order and change it if you needed to. Okay. The one reason why I really like the flow trigger explorer because I'm lazy. I mean efficient. And I like to be able to do as few keystrokes as possible. So if I come here and say, look, I'm doing an opportunity, but it's after, I can go down to the after section of this action related directions, hit the new flow button. And it's skipping a whole bunch of stuff for me. I don't have to set the object. I don't have to configure it. I don't have to hit this. All I have to do is put in the criteria, which is stage equals, I forgot my stage, needs analysis. All right, there we go. So we're going to start with our chatter post. So let's see what our chatter post is. It is when analyzing blah, blah, blah. Oh, that's a boring post. Who came up with that? It almost sounds like it was something that was done or a terrible demo. All right, so it's an action. And we can just type the word chatter, post to chatter. And we could just simply plop our message in here and then say, well, this is the ID that of the record that we're posting the message to, which would be the opportunity ID, and we're done. We could do that. That's boring. What's the fun in that? Because what if we wanted to do something like @mentions or whatever the case may be? Anytime you're dealing with complicated messages, I usually suggest that's a great reason to create a variable or a formula or some resource to basically build out your message. You could use a text template. This is one of the examples where text templates work okay, but we're going to do just a plain old variable here. No, you know what? I changed my mind. Let's do text templates. Do a text template. All right. So one thing to note is, even though chatter posts are rich text and this defaults as rich text, I've been having issues with getting these to actually show up as rich text in the chatter posts. I haven't figured out why yet, so we're going to flip this to plain text and be boring. But what we can do is we have access to everything we have in our flow, which means we can go grab reference information. So maybe we want to add the current stage. We could do that, right? We could technically do this without creating a resource, but it's just more difficult to do because you have such a small place to work with. If we wanted to @mention, let's say, let's @mention the account owner. So we'll go click on the record, get to the account, find the owner ID, and we select owner ID. So this represents the account owner ID. All we need to do to make this mention is we put it in square brackets and add an @ sign. So @ open square bracket, whatever your ID merge field is, close square bracket. So that's your @ mention. And it fills in here. There we go. There. That's done. So we would just save this. Okay. And that leaves our update our next step. That's another exciting next step in our list. We'll go to flow trigger or explore, click new under fast fields. It pre-fills everything again for us. We just have to specify the criteria, which is our stage, being needs analysis. And then we can just insert our next step right here. Oh, this needs to be record. Next step equals analyze means we're done. Other than saving it. So the good news is for most of the things that you're going to be doing, it's these flows aren't going to be very complicated. Typically, almost everyone I've done with workflow rules are no more than a handful of elements. The complicated ones are things that typically are found in process builder, like if you have a process that is updating child records. And those are things where you're going to have to create a loop and have to get the child records and loop through each one, make a change, and then update them in bulk. It's not hard. It's not too complicated, but it is more complicated than the how do we do a field update or something like that. We're out of time, so we don't have time to go through that particular scenario. However, I do have a YouTube channel, and thewizardnews.com is my site where I post the blog posts whenever I think of something to write. My podcast, which hasn't had a new episode for a year due to pandemic reasons, and then my videos. I do occasionally live stream things like this for YouTube. So if you want to see more complicated examples, or you want to view this type of scenario again, it's out there. Feel free to go through it. And if you have questions or you want to see some additional comment or content, tell me what you like to see, and I'll make time to try to make it and put it out there. Other than that, you can find me on Twitter at Kwongerific is my handle, which I will post into the chat here as soon as I can get there in the list. There it is. And of course I'm on, you can find me on the Trailblazer community, but I'm usually lurking Twitter almost all day long. And then of course, if you decide that you don't want to do your migrations on your own and you would like to hire a consultant, you could always reach out to Better Partners and we could be happy to talk with you. I'll leave it open to the floor for questions. Someone would like me to copy the link. Yeah, I will copy the link to my website, because that will have.
Yeah, I'll put it in with the, when I post this out on our group channel too. So
yeah, it has access to. That's where all my stuff ends up going eventually. Any other questions, comments, bad jokes?
I have it's Dad Joke Thursday. I have a dad joke for you if you
I love dad
want to
jokes.
get one of those.
Yes.
So did you hear that if you're pregnant in the Amazon, it's next day delivery?
No, I have not heard that. That's terrible.
That's about what I expected in terms of
that's worse than most dad jokes I've heard.
Yep.
Besides, if you're pregnant in the Amazon, you have to use you have to go to the bathroom in a bottle.
Well, yeah, there's that too. So okay. All right. Well, thank you, Brian, for joining us. I think this was an awesome presentation. I will get this recording published up here in a little bit and get it sent out on our group channel. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. Make sure to check out next month's event that we have. We'll be going over some of the DevOps fun you can have with Cumulus CI and GitHub Actions. So please make sure to check that out and join up. Again, Brian, thank you for your time. This was an excellent presentation, and thank everyone for coming. I'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brian.
Bye.